IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. What we see in India all around nowadays is something that we last experienced in 1975 when there was a formal so-called legal emergency that was imposed by Mrs. Gandhi's government. And since then, after 1977, India has had democratic governments, and this particular government that is administering the country at the moment is also democratically elected. But what we are seeing reminds us of the emergency. Critics and dissenters are being silenced, independent institutions are being compromised, and the media is crawling, but very enthusiastically. This will definitely sound to many of us like the emergency. The recent arrests of journalist and activist Teesta Sittleward, and soon after journalist and fact-checker Mohammad Zubair, have also invoked memories of those dark days. So is the emergency back but without declaring the emergency? Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, who teaches South Asian politics and history at Sciences Po in France and King's College in London, has written two recent books, one about the emergency of 1975 and another on India under Narendra Modi. So this is very, very coincidental. If you put the books together, you can understand what is going on in India. Professor Jaffrelot, who's one of the best known international academics on South Asia, has written several other books on India and Pakistan, including on Hindu fundamentalism, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, and the history of Pakistan. And he is our guest today, and he will try and put some perspective into what has happened and what is happening in India. Professor Jaffrelot, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you, Sidharth. Thank you for the invitation.
Your two recently published books, India's First Dictatorship on the Emergency and another on Modi's India, seem to be somehow now connected in some way. Are we seeing signs of another dictatorship?
Well, if we use the categories of political science, we could say that India today experiences what is known as competitive authoritarianism or electoral authoritarianism. These are concepts that we use in political science to describe regimes which are Janus-like. On the one hand, there are elections. The citizens choose their rulers. But on the other hand, elections are not a level playing field anymore. And in the particular case of today's India, there are two reasons why elections are not a level playing field anymore. One is because BJP is in a position to spend much more money than any of the other opposition parties. In fact, in 2019, it has spent more than $3.5 billion, which is much more than all the other parties for saturating the public sphere, among other things. And secondly, this electoral scene is not a level playing field either because of media coverage that is massively favoring the ruling party. And again, saturation of the public sphere in 2014 and 2019 made the competition very difficult for opposition parties. But what I would add is that we need to go beyond elections. And we need to look at what is politics in India between elections. Because democracy is under attack for more serious reasons when you look at the way checks and balances are not working anymore. Most of the institutions have become instruments of the executive. They are the usual suspects, the CBI, but you can now add the NIA, Election Commission, Central Vigilance Commission, and even more importantly, the judiciary, because the judiciary was the pillar, the main pillar of the rule of law, as it has to be. But we see now Supreme Court of India not taking any decision against the Modi government. For the last 6 years, you can't name one, except possibly the appointment of the new CBI chief, which was probably lately the only indication of some independence. But otherwise, the Supreme Court either validates very controversial measures. We've seen in the past the Aadhaar bill considered as a money bill, electoral bonds that the Election Commission itself had considered as not so good as an idea. And if it does not validate measures of that kind, it sits on the issues. And for years, the Citizenship Amendment Act, abolition of Article 370, no decision has been made on these key issues, which are now 2-3 years old. So that's clearly why, beyond the bias in the election competition, we may say that India has entered a new phase and is experiencing a new kind of regime.
So that really what you're saying, Christophe, is that it's not only not a level playing field, because that we are talking about the elections, that during those 5 years between elections, everything seems to go in favor of the ruling party. Everything. There's hardly any resistance worth the name, and any resistance that does happen doesn't get recorded in any significant way. It gets, in fact, it gets rubbish. And dissidents who raise their voices find themselves, either in jail or harassed with cases, etc. So this is an untenable situation for everybody else, but B, this creates another kind of future scenario in which no other party can ever win.
Well, this is a very important question. I suppose political parties sometimes decide not to contest when they realize that there is no way they can win. I do not only suppose, I saw that. Bangladesh is a case in point lately. Opposition parties just gave up. The situation is not that bad in India at the moment, simply because at the state level, we see a different kind of scenario. And in spite of the recent elections, Uttar Pradesh especially, we have to remember what happened in West Bengal, what happened, of course, in the south, and Punjab, even more recently. You have states, interestingly, at the periphery of the core, at the periphery of the Indie belt. Except Rajasthan, most of the Indie belt is in the hands of BJP. But at the periphery, there is some hope for political parties, opposition parties, to win. So they continue to contest, and for good reasons, because there is so much power at the state level. Except that we've seen on many occasions the loser becoming the winner. BJP may lose elections in Madhya Pradesh, more recently in Maharashtra, and still succeed in getting back. Karnataka is another case of that kind. And this is where money power plays a big role, of course, because every man has a price. You can also offer portfolios, ministerial portfolios, and it works pretty well. We have very strange situations in many states where a large number of ministers are not from the BJP, in fact, because you had to bring them in, and that was what attracted them in the first place. So that's what we can call with Gilles Vernier's predatory politics, which means that even if you can win elections, you may not govern the state you've won. And in spite of so many rules and regulations, you will never prevent a party to take MLAs in an hotel. That's not something you can pass a law against. Well, the day India passes a law against MLAs in hotel rooms, we'll have reached a different level.
Well, I don't know whether you've got the latest thing. It has just happened an hour and a half ago that a new government has been sworn in Maharashtra. And of course, it is not a BJP government because the BJP will support it from outside, which is really speaking a win-win situation in many ways. But you're right. It happened in Assam. It happened in Gujarat. 1/3 of BJP MLAs apparently are from the Congress, which depletes the other parties that much more.
Yeah.
And it almost happened in Rajasthan.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you say that on the periphery, these parties continue winning, and West Bengal was a classic example, Tamil Nadu also, attempts are made to dislodge. It happened in West Bengal with the riots and things like that. And, governor constantly saying there is mayhem on the street. So all these parties have to do two things in their states. They have to win handsomely. And second, they have to constantly be on their guard because somebody or the other will be thrown into jail or raided. In that scenario, I think the federal system, therefore, is what is keeping the center from getting too big bites, too big.
Certainly. I would just qualify that by saying that, yes, federalism is probably the last bastion of democracy, especially now that the judiciary has receded in the background. But it's not what we used to have as a system. If you remember the UPA 1 and 2, you had a federal system that empowered state parties in a really dramatic manner. By contrast, today, you can have demonetization without consulting the chief ministers. You can have the lockdown declared in 5 hours without consulting the chief ministers. So there is clearly a centralization of power at the expense of federalism. And I would add one thing in the same vein. Even social welfare programs are presented as coming from New Delhi, coming from the Prime Minister himself. Many of them are named after the Prime Minister anyway. When you looked at what happened in the previous government under Manmohan Singh, the states could draw benefit from that, and they were credited by the citizens as responsible for welfare programs. So yes, federalism is a very important element of what's left of democracy, but it's not the federalism we used to know in the past 15 years.
Now, we've talked about institutions and the political parties. Coming to individuals, that seems to be another front which the BJP is operating on in full strength. They've gone after activists. They've gone after, we are talking about what's happened in the last few days, but if you remember, even Bhima Koregaon activists, all human rights workers are still languishing in jail. They've gone up after journalists in Uttar Pradesh. But what do you make of Teesta, who's long been a critic and a thorn in the government side, in the party side, and the arrest of somebody like Mohammad Zubair, who's really speaking not an activist as such? How do you see this sudden arrest, back to back more or less, of these two?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's recall that this is taking place in the wake of a Supreme Court decision. And that takes us back to the judiciary question. Why is the judiciary behaving the way we see it behaving? And I would suggest three explanations. One, judges are not appointed the way they used to be. The collegium system is defunct. By the way, that was the first reform the Modi government wanted to introduce as early as July 2014. It failed to change the way, theoretically, on the paper, judges are appointed. They are still supposed to be appointed by the collegium. In practice, they are not. And Justice Thakur fought that battle and lost that battle because his three successors in a row, preferred to resign themselves not to appoint the judges of the Supreme Court by resorting to the collegium. Now, de facto, the government appoints judges and promotes its own sympathizers, especially because the Sangh Parivar has infiltrated the judiciary for a long time. So that's one very important change, a long-term change. It has probably reached a point of no return in terms of the composition of the Supreme Court. But there are other reasons. Ideology is not the only one. Judges are getting post-retirement jobs now without any cooling off period, and they prefer to please the government before retiring. It's very simple. And last but not least, judges are also blackmailed. Government has files on everybody, including judges. And never forget that justices were targeted by the Pegasus malware as well. So I would recontextualize the arrest of Testa Setalvad and R.B. Sri Kumar in this context. Now, that's the precondition. It made it possible. But why has it happened? Well, I think there is a clear attempt to erase the 302 pogrom from the history of India and to take revenge against those who fought for justice. In fact, this pogrom is not even mentioned in history books anymore. It has to leave, it has to go, it has to disappear from the past. And many of the Gujaratis who are ruling India today do not want to be remembered in history for what has happened in their state when they were ruling it. So to suppress the memories of 2002, they need to silence those who are still speaking for the victims. And that was the case of both of them, Testa Setalvad and R.B. Sri Kumar. And they are the last ones in a long list, as you say. The others, the Bhima Koregaon accused, whom you have been mentioning, were also arrested because they dissented. And we are in a situation when no dissent is acceptable. This is exactly what an authoritarian regime does. When someone indulges in repressing dissent, any dissent has to be repressed. There is no limit, especially when you know that the dissenters tell the truth. The truth has to disappear, like the memories of 2002. So all authoritarian regimes work that way. That's why they gradually become police states, resorting to surveillance. Phones are tapped, files are created to blackmail friends and foes, because friends too need to be controlled. Some of them cannot be truly, fully trusted. So gradually you see control becoming an end in itself, state power becoming an end in itself. Today you wonder, why does this government want control, full control for? What are the policies you make possible by being so much in control? Well, it has nothing to do with policies. It's a reflection of a quest of power for the sake of power. And possibly also because of the sense of insecurity. These leaders have never been so sure so secure. And by the way, that's where they never give press conferences. Where they do not know what they could respond to questions they have not prepared in advance. So this sense of insecurity is very deeply rooted and makes this repression reflex even more important. And you can go back, I will just stop with that. You can go back in history and say that Hindu nationalism itself is rooted in a deep sense of insecurity. There is an inferiority complex because of the fear of divisions of Hinduism based on caste and class, because the elite of the country has never been on their side. The intellectual elite has never been on their side. And last but not least, because you have only 37% of the Indians who voted for BJP. So how can you be so sure that you are the hegemon? You're not. And it makes repression even more necessary. Repression of dissent, at least.
We'll be right back after this short break.
सफर, रास्ते, मंजिल और मुकाम अक्सर ये हमसे कुछ कहना चाहते हैं, पर हम हैं कि अपनी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में इन्हें सुनने से कतराते हैं। नमस्ते दोस्तों, मेरा नाम है केशव चतुर्वेदी और मैं आपको ले चलूंगा कुछ ऐसे सफर पर जहां आपको एक नया नजरिया मिलेगा सफर और मंजिलों को देखने का। आइए इन किस्से कहानियों में डूब जाएं, हर मंगलवार और शुक्रवार।
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. But at the same time, I mean, this insecurity and complex, even in the present administration, present ruling party, which comes from the same thing, is a little counterintuitive because you have a large number of MPs, you have an opposition which is in no position at the moment at least to win. The media is on your side. Every institution has been compromised. The elite, the business class, etc., even if they want to say something, are scared. Most ordinary people, the middle classes, are very, I hear this all the time. You must have heard this 1,000 times. It's not safe to criticize openly, etc. In that case, why this insecurity about a small fact checker?
Well, for all the reasons I have listed, I think they are really explaining to a large extent this obsession with repression, to suppress truth, to suppress dissent, and this fear of not being such a strong hegemon, because you're not. But I would add one reason that I think will become more and more important. The economy is not doing well. The economy is in a crisis, and this crisis is probably bound to gain momentum, so to speak. And it's affected not only the economy, but also society. Well, the economy, just to give one example, the rupee has never been so low in spite of the $50 billion already spent by the RBI. And this is the beginning of a crisis that will deepen because of the Ukraine war. Inflation is on the rise, and India is allergic to inflation, like many other countries, because that eats the poor immediately. And joblessness is clearly all-pervasive, and the mobilization of young, jobless Indians who set trains on fire shows that, well, everything can happen now, and therefore the government needs to distract the public opinion from this kind of. So not only you suppress dissent, but you raise issues of a different kind for making people forget that their policies are taking the country in a direction that will not create jobs, that will not make the life of the poor and the middle class easier. So that's clearly a good reason for being insecure. When you do not deliver, you cannot be really sure of your followers.
On the economy, no matter what you do and you distract people, that's a short-term measure, and maybe you can keep on doing it. But ultimately, that will be the legacy. That will be people. I mean, it still may not affect your electoral chances, but that will be the legacy that will be left behind. That he was a poor manager of the economy, which he had promised.
Yeah, but I do think that for Narendra Modi, you do not win elections on economic result. It's really something he learned in 2004 when the Shining India slogan was not sufficient for BJP to win. So that's an additional problem. He doesn't pay attention to the economic issues because that's not a priority for winning elections. Polarization works much better than economic successes for winning elections. And that's an additional problem.
We just discussed two individuals, but when you have a juggernaut, a machine, which is operating full-time 24/7 at your service, like the media, and the chances of the media changing its tune are next to zero, why would you be worried about what a couple of small digital sites say with hardly any following?
Well, I think that these small media actors represent much more than you think. First of all, we are following them abroad systematically, and they are the most reliable sources of information we can think of. Secondly, social media can also amplify what these small outlets say, and they do. And thirdly, even if it's not a mainstream message, a mainstream actor, when someone, even a lonely voice, says something true, it has to be suppressed, because this truth can become popular, and if it spreads, then the king is naked. And the first person who says the king is naked makes the others realize that he's naked, and all of a sudden the king is ashamed and can't cope with his situation. So, as I said, authoritarian regimes have to suppress everybody in the end, because only one dissenting voice can undermine their authority rather quickly. Now, a caveat to that. The way people are brainwashed make them less and less accessible to truth. And the fact that you have been bombarded by propaganda for years makes very difficult sometimes simple explanations to percolate. This is something I'm now realizing with my students who have not heard what happened in India, not only in 2002, but on many other occasions. You have to train them in everything. And that's a big challenge, which makes the kind of work we are doing much more complicated than before, because we have to not only counter prejudices, but we have to inform, to go back to the basic elements of the Indian history. So maybe one day nobody will believe in anything except lies.
That kind of is a little true in other societies also, as we saw for 4 years in the United States. That's true of other places too, other countries too, such as what we saw in the United States, where people actually believe that the election was stolen. And now it emerges that President Trump wanted to join the rioters. So you can imagine. Do you think, this has been intriguing me quite a bit, but do you think that the BJP is in a bit of a hurry? because certain things, this particular from 2019 onward, things have moved rapidly, much more than in the first 5 years. Do you think there is a sense of urgency to achieve something?
I don't know. This is a difficult question. There may be reasons for being in a hurry we don't know. The economic, social and economic crisis may be a good reason for suppressing dissent and for also distracting people from other realities. That's clearly one possibility. There may also be the need to pacify hardliners, and it's something you see when you surf on the social media. There is now, I would say, a right-wing in BJP, a right-wing dimension of BJP, or people who are out of BJP, who are asking for more, always more. So you have to diffuse this kind of tension. But frankly speaking, this acceleration is very relative, because the speed of events since 2014 is already quite remarkable when you think of all the campaigns we've seen. And if you look only at the ones directed against Muslims, we had the anti-love jihad, Garvapsi, of course, cow protection related campaigns, anti-land jihad. You know, every 6 months or so there is something new. And that's also only in this domain. So there may be a sense of precipitation now, acceleration now, but there is in any case a trend. And I'm not sure it's really announcing something relatively different. You know, there may be a difference in degree, but the sense of direction is the same.
So just when these arrests were happening, President Modi was in Germany meeting world leaders. And everyone, at least by reports appearing in the Indian media, everyone gave him a warm welcome. They went out of his way to shake their hand. President Macron also was very warm. Now, again, I must clarify that this is what has appeared here, and the gifts he gave to all these world leaders. But the fact of the matter is that world leaders, especially Western countries, developed countries, are not calling out the Indian government for all that is happening. What could be one reason? What could be the reasons for this warmth, this extra mile that they are walking just to be warm towards India?
Well, I would say two things there. This warmth is clearly a legacy of the idea that India would be necessary to balance China. That was an idea that crystallized, well, along with the idea of the Indo-Pacific, something like 5 years ago. That has been reinforced now by the idea that, well, we may win over India in its new variant of the Cold War, that is the relations between the West and Russia. Now, the idea that India may not remain neutral is still there, and there is some hope in the West that eventually India will realize that to get its weapons from Russia only or mostly is really not a good idea. First of all, because these weapons are not terribly effective in Ukraine itself. Secondly, because some of the supply chain will be delayed, if not destroyed, by the condition of Russia in the near future. So these are the two reasons, China and Russia, where there is certainly a kind of reflex of forgiving or forgetting what's going on in the country. Secondly, there is still this idea that this is a huge market and we have a lot of things to sell, including weapons. And that's an additional reason for not interfering with domestic policies or events in India. Now, that said, what I could see in the US, in UK, even in France, is a new sense of hesitation. And that's a recent development, I must say. We are approached as scholars by ministers of foreign affairs, ministries also of defense, and asked, where is India going? What is the next flare-up? When? Where? Very precise questions, interestingly. This is new. It's not public, but it's reflecting a new awareness that was not there only 6 months or 1 year ago. So this warmth may not be forever, and the Ukraine war, the relationship of India with Russia may play a different role, in fact, if the West realizes that there is no way India can become a friendly country, a partner, even an ally. That's the kind of response I would give, which is not an easy one, but reflecting some changes and some evolution.
So that sense of what an alarm of what was happening in India was always there, but it has begun to be articulated that much more forcefully, etc. And because we are already importing a lot of oil from Russia, and that you can justify, you can understand, because we need oil, we don't have too much money to pay. So if it's coming, why not take it? But if that continues, then I think, as you said, there will be some rethink in Western capital.
There'll be a sense of uneasiness, definitely. That is already palpable and quite understandable. There was a trust that seems to have been betrayed. There is a disappointment. And it remains to be seen how will that translate in concrete terms. It may have minimal effects. For instance, some transfers of technology may not take place simply because the fear of seeing this technology elsewhere in the hands of friends, but also enemies of the West, may be one of the fear, maybe there. So that would be a minimal impact. You may have larger consequences in terms of trade deals, all these FTAs which are supposed to be negotiated at the moment. This is a difficult process for many reasons, including, for instance, the fact that you think in terms of flows of data, but India doesn't have any credible personal data protection law. And that's only one of the challenges that will be met when the FTAs will be negotiated. So that can have larger consequences, but it's too early to say, really too early. This war will last for a long time, and the consequences it will have on the economies of our countries will impact the geopolitical relations, inevitably. How far? Really, it's too early to say.
So to not sum up, but to look forward, where do you see India heading? Socially, politically, economically? You ended that particular answer with a reference to the Ukraine-Russia war. And if that continues for a long time, there'll be an impact everywhere. Where do you see India heading in the next few years?
There is hardly any moment when you say, well, we've reached a point of no return. So things can change. What we can predict is that the economy will not recover easily in the context of today. That's almost certain. And that will be a big challenge. Stagflation is around the corner. And that's very bad for job creation. That's for the economy. Society will definitely remain polarized, because this is the dominant style of politics, and society will have to resist polarization as much as it can. Politically, state elections of 2022, 2023 will be interesting to follow. Gujarat, definitely. Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh. These state elections will prepare the ground for the 2024 elections. If the opposition parties realize that it's only by joining hands that they can dislodge BJP from power, and if they show that practice, if they experiment this practice at the state level, there may be some alternative in the making. That's what happened in places like Turkey, Israel. It took 15 years to opposition parties to join hands and finally, at least temporarily, dislodged Netanyahu from power in Israel. If that does not happen...
You mean Israel?
Yeah, that's...
You mentioned Turkey.
Well, Turkey is also a place where you see the opposition parties joining hands, and Erdogan may have a tough time next year to win the elections once again. Even in this very authoritarian regime that Turkey has become, you can see a possibility for an alternative because of this new attitude of opposition parties. So that's why I say a point of no return is not easily reached, and there are many ifs, but the sense of direction can change for sure. I'm not considering that it's game over. It's not game over.
Okay, so on that note, I will not say whether it's a hopeful note, pessimistic note, or optimistic one. But on that note, we just heard a very, very academic and yet very, very grounded assessment of what is happening in India at the moment and where it is likely to go. But then this was Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, author of so many books on India and the neighborhood, talking to us. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Sidharth.
Yeah. We'll be back once again next week with another guest on the Wire Talks. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the team, goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people, and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Hello everyone, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcasts Network. On the Habit Coach podcast, we bring you a Pride Month special episode. Fertility specialist Dr. Yuvraj Jadeja talks to Ashton about safe queer sex practices. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik speaks with Rahul Thappa, managing director of Naviga, on the watchmaker's craft. On Smarter with Sid, Sidharth ponders over how content creator PewDiePie manages to stay relevant. On Hansvani, a tribal woman takes a stand against her abusive husband in the story Var. And on Ek Chuski Finance, Priyanka highlights the importance of estate planning. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcast has just launched its merch, and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcast's website and click on the Shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platforms that you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and advertising on the network. We would really appreciate if you could spare a few minutes to fill it. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week. Capgemini, Intel vPro, and Intel future bana wonderful with Intel powered laptops.